Okay, welcome again. I feel particularly privileged to host this panel, really for three reasons. And I'm an old consultant, so I have to do everything in threes, right? So the first is the topic. We did this a little bit in a marketing way. The overall pop-up was why the time for India is now. And I just want to flip that question to be true to the panelists and say, is it truly a time for India now, as opposed to just assuming that it is? The second is we have a variety of perspectives. We have an investment perspective, we have an entrepreneurial perspective, and we have a multi-perspective, because John wears multiple hats, but in this hat, an academic perspective. And each of them are truly the leaders in their field. And secondly, just personally, people that I respect, given the kind of values and governance with which they do what they do, which isn't what necessarily the norm always in conducting business in India. So with that, let me start. Really what we're going to do in the panel is start with some opening remarks from each of the panelists. I'll ask a few questions and then at the end leave a little bit of room for you all to ask questions. And so in the opening remarks, if I can, if each of you could actually answer this fundamental question, do you think we're at a unique time for India, that there's some unique opportunity in this kind of period? And the way we look at that is by saying, if you look at consumer businesses that you're building in, investing in, or researching, are they at some unique kind of point? Are there certain opportunities or are there certain challenges that you're experiencing from each of those lenses? So with that, maybe I can start with Zishan, are you comfortable to start? And,
Sure.
And then maybe we'll come back.
Sure. So, hi, I'm founder of Topper.com. Topper is a learning app for K-12 students, 5th grade to 12th grade. So we supplement school learning. We sort of multiply your school learning at home. I think the opportunity for us to build this company right now in India is unique because of two reasons. One is the major overall reason of like high internet penetration, accessible devices. And that's like pretty much known. So sub $100 Android devices, deep internet penetration now with increasingly with Geo and stuff. That's the overarching reason for pretty much all internet companies. But specifically in education, what is happening is the exams are moving away from being subjective to being objective exams. And also the examination, the way the exams are conducted is moving away from being online in the classroom to offline in the classroom to online. So this is a very fundamental shift that is happening, that is helping consumers try to believe in an online model. So that's a big opportunity for education in India. And of course, you know, supplemental learning is culturally rooted in India, right? So you go to school, you also go to a tuition class or a coaching class. And that the second tuition/coaching class is slowly disintegrating or can be disrupted using the online opportunity that is available right now.
Okay, thank you. Just specifically, can you, this idea of coaching, I mean, this tutoring, which we hear, and test prep, is something we hear which is a little different than other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And I know you think about it in a very integrated fashion. Can you just talk a little bit about that before we switch?
Sure. So, like India, everyone, like 70% students use some sort of tuition/coaching class, primarily because the public schools are bad, the private schools are almost there, like equally bad, and therefore you need like supplemental coaching. Now, traditionally we've thought of school learning and test prep as two different categories because that's how they were structured from the supply side. When you think of it from the demand side, you don't think, hey, I need to attend a supplemental program and I need to attend a primary program, or I need to attend a board exam program and a test prep program, right? You just think about, I need to get through my 11th grade. I need to get through my 10th grade. While getting through my 10th grade, I need to do these things, right? I need to prepare for my board exam so that I can score 80%, and I need to prepare for these two exams, and I need to do something extra. So from the demand side, you always think about something very integrated. Because in an offline world, you can't have so many segments of supply. We've always thought of it as test prep and schooling separately. But when you shift to online, it's all like very integrated.
Okay. So maybe we can switch to GV and then John, because I know you have invested in this space. So maybe, it might be a natural transition.
Sure. My name is GV Ravishankar. I'm a partner at Sequoia Capital. We manage 6 funds for India, and we invest in education as one of the themes that we like. I sit on the board of 3 education companies. A company called Byju, which is in the learning business. They run a mobile app that helps educate millions of children in India. I'm on the board of a school management company called K-12 Techno Services that manages 25 schools and about 25,000 kids through that. And I'm also an investor in a company called Eruditus Learning, which is in the higher education space, helping Ivy League schools in the US take their programs to global markets. And so through the eyes of these companies and being involved, I'd say we've seen the journey, and I've been investing in India since 2006 and started with the first investment in a company called Tutor Vista, which got sold to Pearson, which was also an education company. We've actually seen the evolution of education and edtech in India. And the why knife question is relevant because in my opinion, I think point number 1, Dishan mentioned, which is around internet and availability of devices, etc. But I want to double click on that just to tell you guys the magnitude of change that's happened in the last 24 months. Post Jio launch, which was September 2016 to now, we've had 300 million new subscribers added who have access to almost the lowest cost of internet anywhere in the world. And this is a tremendous shift. Rajan Anandan of Google would tell you that YouTube consumption in India grew 4x in 1 year, thanks to Jio. And we have seen every single company of ours be touched by what Jio has created as this distribution and low-cost distribution across the country. And for example, Byju is a beneficiary of that trend. They grew their fastest last year versus any other time in their history, and they went from about 75 million to 200 million in revenues, and all thanks to kind of the distribution reach that Jio has created for us. The other thing that's happened, which I think is interesting, but a small but an interesting development, is the emergence of fintech companies in India. Now there are companies that are willing to finance education much more actively than before. So the banks traditionally thought of education as necessary thing that they had to do, but they were not really keen to do this because their general experience has not been great, and mostly the public sector banks were doing this. Today now a lot of fintech companies can use data, alternate data sources, and be able to credit profile a customer and be able to issue a loan in under a few minutes, which has again significantly improved the willingness and the ability of people to pay. And that's another trend that we've seen that has actually accelerated the adoption of edtech in India. The last point I'd make is, we ran a survey a couple of years ago, met a bunch of people and asked, hey, how comfortable are you with online learning or edtech, right? And people kind of found that question funny because they said, no, we're already learning online. And when you ask them, how are you learning online? Their point is, look, whenever we don't know something, we go on Google and we see the answer and learn. So that is online learning. So why are you asking this question? It's kind of second nature to us already. So this whole thing saying, hey, will people go onto devices and learn, etc., seems like a question that's irrelevant because people are already doing it in a significant way. So I'd say those are some of the trends we see, and it's we see it across age groups. One of the largest viewed YouTube channels in Asia is a company that's run out of Chennai, which does nursery rhymes. And they have, I don't know how many billion views in a year, and, quite popular. So, the next generation of kids are digitally native. And so this is not going to appear like something of a shift that they have to make. That'll be the natural way they learn.
Thank you, Jay. John, I know you've also written about Byju, which GV was speaking of. Maybe can you pick up from here?
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is John Kim. I teach at Harvard Business School. And the topic that I'm actually spending a lot of time thinking about is what role does entrepreneurship and innovation play in terms of improving educational outcomes around the world? And you started off with a question around why is this a good time? I think globally, if you think about large countries such as India or China and places like that, we have actually achieved universal K through 6, at least, enrollment. So it's not about the access to education. Now I think the focus is on the quality of education. And in a particular place like India, the reason why I'm so particularly interested in this marketplace is, number one, it's a very large market. It's about 250, 260 million school children. Compare that to the US, which is about 5 times what the US is. And secondly, about 45% thereabouts, people have actually opted out of the public school system to go to a privately run school. And I think Zizan already mentioned it, but I would probably be a little bit more provocative and say, public schools in general in India are horrible. And you have situations where teachers are teaching 60 kids at a time or something like that in a room, and the very basic methodology of teaching is, I know something, I'm going to write it on a blackboard and you need to copy it down, and that's the pedagogy. And I think the private school system in general is better than that, but not a lot better. And so there are two, I think, important questions that come out of that. Number one, if you believe in a free market system where parents using the ideas around transparency and choice and being able to have consumer choice and being able to select the schools that they want to send their kids to, now about half the kids in India are doing that, will that actually, that level of competition, transparency, accountability raise the overall quality of education in India? And I think there's some evidence that's happening, although we're kind of early in that stage. And then the second is that I think it creates an incredible opportunity for entrepreneurs to say, hey, there could be a better way. It's a consumer-driven market as opposed to the US where 90% of the students are actually in public schools. So in the country like the US where we spend so much, we're conditioned to believe that the government is going to provide it and that it's a reform effort. Whereas I think in India, we have this opportunity for a consumer-driven, choice-driven, quality-driven opportunity. And I think it's just an incredible opportunity for entrepreneurs who believe that that can create new services. And I think Baiju, Topper, I mean, the people sitting in this panel, I think are good examples of that. So it's very exciting. That being said, we haven't seen evidence of huge marketplace of people coming into that. So maybe it's up to investors like Sequoia over here, GV, to promote that. But I think that's what makes it so interesting.
Thank you, John. Vamsi, same question, and maybe you can comment also, given GV is saying, look, there's some fundamental changes that are taking place in consumer perception, in support functions like internet provision and financing. Yeah. Do you actually see that and experience that in building a business on the ground and therefore affecting the growth of your business today?
Yeah, 100%. So hi guys, I'm Vamsi, CEO and co-founder of an online tutoring company, Vedantu. So we cater to 6th grade to 12th grade, and we are the largest online tutoring company out of India. We focus on live interactive classes, and as GV and Zishan said, I completely concur. The geo effect, which is very real in India, it's almost like more than the population of US is coming online in just 2.5 years time. What we have seen as not just an educational company, but in general any internet company in India, the content usage has significantly, an order of magnitude has increased over the last 1.5 years to be very specific. So just on Vedantu, earlier we used to have less than like 500,000 guys who used to come online and interact with the content. We just have seen that ballooning up to 8 million per month, which is almost more than like 50 million guys come and interact with our free content on a yearly basis. That's massive. And that actually clearly addresses the question that, is it a right time for India? If you look at it, the parents and the students are by default, coming online, trying to get their help. And that's not their second choice, that's their first choice. And we clearly done surveys, spoke to the students and parents, and we are seeing this over and over again that they don't look at this as a secondary option. They are looking at this as a primary option, their first default way to go and search for help. And if this doesn't work out, that is when they are going back to the offline equivalent. So it's a very interesting opportunity. And one more point I would like to just point out is, unlike the US or the Europe, the parents in India are very aspirational. It's more of a Southeast Asian phenomenon, and that need was any which ways there. And with this online penetration coming in, it's a very real opportunity for companies which can use technology to scale to actually enter into India and do some stuff.
So Vamsi, just a question on your model. So if I think from the vantage point of which most people in the US would think about tutoring, they would think about kind of one-on-one or maybe a very small group of people. Mm-hmm. And your model is really around I think it's gone up from 200 to 500 today, yes, right? Yeah. So the live online tutoring is 500 recipients and one teacher.
Yes.
So the core proposition of tutoring, of being very individualized, are you actually able to achieve that with such a large group? And would you actually benefit potentially from, I know, for example, Baiju has tested it and gone to asynchronous, right? And so can you just comment on that?
Very interesting question. So we in fact started off with one-on-one when we started this company in 2014, but the fundamental problem with one-on-one is it's expensive. For a country like India, in order to scale that kind of a service is extremely tough. So just to give you some numbers, one-on-one would cost up to like $10 or even go up to $15 per hour, which for a country like US it's still okay, but in India it's pretty expensive and you can't scale that kind of a service. So the very natural stuff to do is like how can you leverage the same teacher and spread it across multiple students. And we started off with 50, then 100, 200, and technology is something which we really been able to leverage in order to create a construct wherein there is a main teacher and his capacity to actually deliver a very personalized instruction to a group of 200 and now 500, along with assisted by secondary teachers who are TAs, who would be assigned for a cluster of students who would be ensuring that their doubts are being solved. And there's obviously a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence which is being used, which is able to predict the kind of doubts which are being asked and able to intervene then and there itself. And the content is also extremely created to be extremely interactive. So inside this live class, although there are 200 and 500 students, every few minutes there is always some interaction happening with the content, and that interaction is being captured, and not just captured, it's being used to personalize the content for every student after the class.
But you don't think you could add all of those layers of interactivity with an asynchronous video?
That's a lovely question. In fact, from the last panel, I remember Mayank also referring to this. What we have noticed is, given my own background as being a teacher in offline setup before starting with Antu, there's a small percentage of students who are very self-motivated, and they just, if they give them content, they would essentially cover the entire content. And for those kind of kids, the asynchronous works perfectly. But in our own opinion, especially in K-12, we have seen that it requires a very strong orchestration of some individual being there and pushing the student to go through the entire content, being disciplined and consuming the content and intervening where he or she is not, able to do that, right? This is extremely important to ensure that the engagements and the completion rates are there. And completion rates are important because in K-12, it's all about learning outcomes. And if the results and the learning outcomes isn't happening, essentially that's where a parent is sending the kid to an offline or online center is for. So in our own thesis, this aspect of human-led intervention is extremely important for the child to complete the entire course. And that's where we see that this kind of an intervention really helps. And we have completion rates, attendance rates of in fact 86% on our year-long programs, which is a very intensive, like almost 45 hours per month kind of courses, right? And we have seen that when you don't have that kind of an intervention, we have done that A/B testing, that rates actually from 86% goes as low as 15%. So that's a massive delta.
So I've been encouraged to be provocative, so I'm wondering how I do that to that statement. But let me, John, you talked about how we're having a learning crisis and we need to fundamentally improve the education system in India, right? Both Zishan and Vamsi are really providing a third-party solution, which you see tutoring or test prep. It's not actually fixing the formal system. So some people would argue, shouldn't we be putting our capital and resources, be trying to fix the actual formal system? And so therefore, how do you think about that, both coming from providing that versus looking at it kind of from a macro picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think fixing the system in a country the size of India and complexity is just really hard. I mean, it's just fundamentally. The one thing that, so with both of these, these entrepreneurs and the services that you guys have created, which is, it's essentially working in a system where the rules are very clear. I mean, it's just fascinating. If you think about in the US, and I think the latest scandal, the admission scandal, just goes to show that we have a system of getting into college where the rules of getting in are essentially not clear and is subjective, and therefore it's prone to scandal. In India, there may be other issues, but the rules of getting into college, which is essentially there's a supply constraint, right? For the number of students who actually want to go to a top college, there are not enough seats. And so therefore, the way to get into a top college is to actually test really well on a very high stakes exam, which everybody takes. So regardless of whether or not you think this is a good way to promote higher education, the rules are actually clear. And so I think that creates opportunities for the entrepreneurs like we have here to create systems to do that. So if you want to talk about reforming the entire educational system, it's not only about fixing the school, you actually have to create entire societal rules around how do you actually get ahead, how do you actually break the cycles of social mobility and all that kind of stuff, which I think is a huge issue.
So John, you're saying there is a certain test, and therefore it's clear in order to go through those hoops, you need a certain system to support that, and therefore you have test prep providers.
Yeah, test prep providers.
So let me just, when we look at test prep, actually you guys are working with children from all the way from grade 5 to grade 12, right? So when we think about test prep in the US, we think about preparing for the SAT so it's like a very finite kind of period of time where you're practicing for a test and doing that test. Yet you guys are actually doing it for a long period of time. So the line between preparing for school and actually doing test prep is quite gray. So do you see yourself as supporting the core educational system, or do you see yourself as test prep providers?
So, test prep comes only in 11th and 12th grade. When we start off in 5th grade, we are essentially supplementing your school learning. And in most cases, students are actually learning for the first time on the app. They go to the school, sit through the hours, come back, and actually learn for the first time, not during the school hours, but after school hours. So we are actually building the foundation for a test prep that will eventually come and will be blended in your learning. So I don't distinguish between school learning and test prep, right? It's all blended, and you need to start early because schooling system is more or less broken. And to John's point, should we fix the primary schooling learning system? Yes, if we had billions of dollars, it would take us 2 generations to fix it. Because for us to fix it, it's not just money, but also the aspiration of a 4th grader to stand up and say, hey, I want to be a teacher when I grow up. And unless you start paying teachers, which we don't do currently, we're not going to fix the primary system.
That's true. No, that's true. I think it's not just education; it's a socio-economic fabric which needs to change for that, the change to come about. Specifically talking about the question you asked, see, it's a market which has been there. It's a need which has been there for decades and decades, right? When we grew up, the tutoring market was there, and this fundamentally exists because of like what we discussed, the public system and the teachers not being paid enough. So there aren't good teachers. Forget about tier 2, tier 3 locations, even in top metros like Bangalore, right? And that's where the parents really look forward to some tutor outside the school, right, for them to actually do that supplemental learning, right? That's where the whole after-school tutoring market exists, right? And the companies are coming out with online solutions and those things, but fundamentally, if you take a step back, that need is always have been there. It's been decades and decades since this need has been there. So it's fundamentally no new market which is there. The need is real. It's just new solutions, and using technology, we are able to do that at much better scale and also offer it at much better price.
So what I'm hearing from you is, look, the formal education system is so fundamentally broken and is going to take so much money, time, and complication to change. The private sector has a clear role to play, not just in private K-12 schools, because they also have low quality, that you have third-party private providers supplementing private K-12 schools, right? And so let me ask, what is the kind of headway and growth that you see in this space, or maybe I can come to you, GB, when you look beyond this space, what are the areas that you are most excited about as you look at investing going forward in different areas of education in India?
Yeah, we'll probably overweight on K-12 and K-12 linked, opportunities, because that's where, like John mentioned, we have more than 250 million kids going to school, and they all need some form of help. And we have to remember that it all backs down from maybe higher ed, right? If you have only a small amount of supply of very high quality institutions, then this whole funnel has to converge to those small set of people, which means it gets competitive. And so yes, people prepare in 11 and 12, but the seeds of preparation start even as early as 6th grade. There are programs for IIT, which are called these foundation programs that start in 6th grade, right? So it sounds crazy, but it's true, right? And because people are so worried about making it to the best schools, and unless the quality at the top kind of expands, you will have this competitive system because of the number of people we have going in. So I'd say for us, hence, K through 12 continues to remain the opportunity that we're most excited about. And, we see various new forms. I guess the core question and, maybe for all of edtech is really cost of customer acquisition. Given, entry barriers are low, lots of people do enter and, finally Google and Facebook make lots of money. But companies that are acquiring customers, are struggling to make the economics work, right? So really, better models, better mousetraps to get consumers are areas we're interested in. For example, Q&A is an interesting market. It's happened in China, it's happened globally. Students are going and, finding out answers online, and so whoever's able to, provide those answers in a low-cost way, get a lot of traffic. So that could be one area of interest. But things like that where people are helping these kids learn better, and I don't think this is a winner-take-all market by any stretch of imagination. So we do expect several billion-dollar companies to be built in a market like this, and so we are quite excited about that.
But so one of the interesting things when I go teach, especially in places like China and India, I ask parents in the audience, "Hey, what do you wish for your kids? When they grow up, what do you wish for them to come out of education?" And one parent said to me, "Before I had my kids, I wanted my kids to be happy. But after I had my kids, I want them to go to an Ivy League school." Right? So, but I think this is the dichotomy. So as much as we can sit up here and say, look, the education system is broken, it needs to be reformed, because who wants to have kids who are good at math and, be good at tests? We want them to be well-rounded in communication, collaboration, all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, those things are really hard to, test and to progress monitor. And so that makes great education policy. I think that makes great societal sense. I think it makes for terrible friends for entrepreneurs in the education space, because those things can only be measured over a long, long period of time. And like, for example, when I talk to superintendents in the leafy Fairfield, Connecticut, where all the kids are from the executives and so on, the parents and the superintendents will say, "Boy, I hate standardized tests. We hate it. But when the scores come out and it looks great, boy, you know what's the first thing that I'm going to tell everybody? Our scores are great." Right? So this is the dichotomy, and this is the challenge. And I would say that, in India, this is even more true. It's even more accentuated, because I'm sure people want kids to grow up to be well-rounded, ready for the real world. But the only way we can measure their progress is probably all the tests that you guys are probably helping them to do better on.
I feel India is right now blessed to have a standardized objective test instead of essay and storytelling to get to where you are, because essay writing and storytelling is reserved for the privileged. And right now, for anybody from the bottom segment to have a shot at a good college is through an objective test. So until all of us move up and until India becomes a society as privileged as the US, I feel that objective is a blessing for us.
I think we got to also remember that the overall context, right? So we all grew up, most of us possibly, parents would tell you, what do you want to become? It's either engineer or doctor, because there are only few careers that paid you enough for a decent living, right? And you couldn't be a person in music and make a lot of money. You couldn't be, let's say a hockey player and make a lot of money. And things are changing, but that will change only when purchasing power improves and people are starting to spend on things beyond necessities, right? So, for example, today you could be a cricketer and do really well because, there's IPL and there's so many ways to make money. So sports has become a career, music is becoming a career, right? So some of these didn't exist. So when those things change, then you won't have this problem of people wanting to only do a few things. Yeah. And then that will kind of reduce the pressure on test prep and so on and so forth. So dignity of labor will improve. So these are things that have to happen, but these are not things that happen overnight. It's going to take probably a few decades, but we'll get there, right? And then we'll look more like the US where, people will say, okay, you can be happy.
So your grandchildren can be happy. Till then,
that's why we have
children well studied.
That's why we need mindfulness apps to make everybody really happy. That's the next big area.
Well, I feel tempted to comment, which is, how do we do both? Which is actually, make sure we are on a certain learning curve to the test, but also have well-being and holistic learning. But I'm not allowed to comment, so I snuck that in.
Oh no,
John,
we'll let you.
So, John, you triggered this conversation by talking about the U.S. and you have this unique kind of comparative lens because you look at multiple geographies. And so here we are, many of us biased because we're in India and looking at India, saying this is the unique opportunity. When you look at India relative to what you're seeing in terms of opportunities in Latin America or elsewhere, Kami and I were meeting a number of entrepreneurs yesterday, and their question was, I have bandwidth and capital to enter 1 or 2 markets. Like, I'm big in the US, and so they're making these trade-off decisions between which market to enter. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if you're not in the US, I'm not sure you should come to the US because it's a tough market. I mean, if you're a B2C company, look, so fundamentally in the US, the opportunities for edtech entrepreneurs, either you're going to have to go into the B2B, go straight into, if you're K-12, you're going to go in. If you're early childhood, that's a consumer-driven market. Parents are actually spending money in the US around that, or higher ed. And there's tremendous amount of opportunities in K-12, but that is an institutional, you have to understand how the school systems are structured in the US. I think places like India and China, it's a consumer-driven marketplace. And what that means is you get opportunities to innovate on a pretty rapid cycle of change and innovation. It's not a 9-month purchasing cycle where essentially, in the US, if you want to sell something in the school district in general, what that means is you have to do an RFP. It's an open request for proposal. People compete based on features. I call it the feature war, because the person who's using it is not actually the one who actually makes the decision. It's the person who has to decide which product to buy. And guess what? What's the best way to figure out which product to buy? Oh, you have 12 features and you have 13. I like 13 because 13 must be better than 12.
In India, that's not true. 13 is an unlucky number.
Oh, yeah, okay. So make it 14. We just skip 13th floor and make it 14, right? I mean, because you can't really decide. And besides, the person who makes the decision is not the person who uses it. In India, it's a consumer-driven marketplace. So you actually have this opportunity to say, I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, I want to go try this out because you're sitting here saying, hey, 1 to 200 is a whole lot better than 1 to 1. And we're like, oh, wow, that's great. That sounds fantastic. Well, then 1 to 500 must be even better.
Better, and even cheaper.
Right? So that's but you must have ways to actually demonstrate that, which makes it kind of interesting model.
So let me ask 1 or 2 quick questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience. The first is, you mentioned China, and this is like the hot button topic, which I think many investors talk about, and they do this comparative China-India, right? And GV, I know your team, you have an Asia team which covers China, and I know you look and compare different markets. So specifically, when you look at opportunities in China versus India, I know there's very different price points, very different market. But often what we hear from entrepreneurs is saying, on the one side, we see this bigger opportunity in China in terms of ability to pay. On the other side, the regulation and uncertainty and competition is much trickier. So do you have a point of view, and when you look at these 2 markets the way some folks in the audience may?
Yeah, we rarely compare it to China, although we know that from a willingness to pay and the desire to kind of progress, etc., there is similarity. So we look for trends to see what are the areas and how are different companies doing things. But it is also a very different market. For example, there is no English market in India. Lots of people have tried. It's never worked. And it's possibly because part of the private schooling system is already in English. Indians have a way to communicate in English even if they don't know English, and you only have to travel to India and figure out everywhere there is English stuff. Forget the spelling, but it's all in English either way, right? So there's a natural, for some reason, affinity to English, which doesn't exist in China. And so English learning has been a huge trend there, and we haven't found anything in India to speak of, right? So there are, quite a bit of differences that we see, but we looked at them to say, hey, from a specific markets, K through 12, which is more comparable, not formally, but in the supplementary learning side, what are the things that they are doing? And for example, this whole doubt clearance as a theme has been a very big theme there. That's led to a online tutoring market, which is interesting. So we think some of those will pan out. But we've learned that only we keep talking about China. They don't seem to talk about India, so it's okay.
Let me ask pick up on something you said in your earlier comments, GV, and actually bring the entrepreneurs back in, which is this cost of customer acquisition, right? This big question for entrepreneurs and investors: what is the cost of customer acquisition relative to lifetime value? Mm-hmm. And interestingly, John was in India some time back, and we were talking, and he said, look, in the US, most of customer acquisition is predominantly online, whereas you have lots of feet on the street. Right? So the dynamics of a purely online business versus the number of feet on the street you have is this question is, how do you think about your cost of customer acquisition and the efficiency of that given how many feet on the street you have as you expand?
So yeah, India is a strange country. So when we look at China, first of all, I drop 1 0 to make sense, right? So they say 8 million monthly actives. So I say, we are 8 million registered users. They are 8 million monthly actives. So if you have to draw insights, I drop 1 0 and then try to make sense of it. And sometimes there is insight, right? So for example, what they pay per user in China is similar to what they pay per user in Topper and Baiju. So TAL and New Oriental revenue per user is equal to Topper and Baiju's revenue per user. So ultimately it starts to make sense. Now customer acquisition cost. In China, they acquire customers by having this free Q&A and then they sell something else. And we acquire customers through organic traffic or SEO written articles and then sell them Q&A. So our premium product is like live Q&A and their acquisition strategy is live Q&A. So, just differences galore. For example, most of our spend is on Google and TV, and Chinese, I don't think they are spending that much on Google. So again, very different approaches. But at the fundamental level, willingness to pay, a mother's willingness to pay for the kid is intact, is similar, right? So yes, similarities, but lots of differences also. Q&A is, in China, Q&A is mostly to get past homework, so it's essentially like quasi-cheating. Whereas in India, Q&A is to actually do better at exams. There's no pressure of homework. So for some of the Chinese investors or companies to understand that, why would students buy this service? This should be a customer acquisition strategy. Is very confusing, and even more so for the American investors.
Abs, you want to pick up, and specifically this kind of feet on the street?
No, just borrowing on Zishan's point, I think so we need to understand the context here, right? So the feet on street works in India because it's cheap. I mean that's the fact of the matter. If you do your maths and if maths works out perfectly well, it won't work out for a country like China. Forget about US. I mean, don't even talk about it, right? So it works because it tends to be even cheaper than me spending $100 on a Google ad. Right, probably, and that's basically it. It's the maths phenomenon. It perfectly works, and so that's the maths part of it. The consumer insight part of it is it's simple. Here in India, we are still. So TAL is one of our investors. So I spend a lot of time looking at their companies. So the trends which has happened in China in terms of live tutoring, GV mentioned that's a typical acquisition curve which they follow, which is essentially get guys to consume some free stuff, which can be a Q&A or content, and then essentially get them down and acquire them. We have very similar trends in India as well. We have very strong top of the funnel, including Baiju's, including Topper, including Vedantu. But the conversion, which in China happens through probably a WeChat conversions, because the people there are much used to it, much used to online, which is not the trend when they were in 2000 and 2011, right? But in India, right now, people are not that used to online products. And that's exactly where the counseling or the intervention comes in, wherein you need someone to convince a parent to buy a $800 to $1,000 course, which is typically the average price points of all these online products. You need someone to actually be there and actually talk to the parent, because it's not something which is he has done when he was studying, right? So it requires that counseling, and I think it's going to be the trend for the next 3 to 4 years. And once the brand is set up, once it's a de facto thing that, okay, fine, online is the way to go, then probably we'll taper out from there. So it's more of a intermediate stuff, which I believe.
I'll come to you. I may let GV, he's catching a flight, I may let him just slip out if it's okay. And then we can just go ahead with your comment and then maybe open up to one question.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, GV. Thank you. Safe travels.
So I have a quick point on the feet on street. Pretty much every single Indian internet company is built on feet on street. And that's primarily because of lack of payment infrastructure. So Flipkart's cash on delivery was like quasi feet on street. Ola's paying in cash to the cab driver was feet on street. Swiggy's delivery boy collecting cash from you is their feet on street. Baiju, Topper, Vedantu having our own fleets are feet on street. Naukri, Make My Trip, Naukri, Just Dial, they all have feet on street, India Mart. So pretty much all internet companies have a feet on street primarily because of the lack of payment infrastructure. And as we develop our payment infrastructure over the next, let's say 10, 15 years, feet on street will begin to disappear.
Anshu, what's interesting is in the US, when you think about supplemental education, remedial education is bought, not sold. In other words, if you look at the Sylvan ads and Sylvan Learning Center ads in the US, what they demonstrate is our kids, it's like the typical kid comes home, he has a C- on a test, and then the parent sends the kid to a Sylvan Learning Center, and after a few hours of tutoring, he has a big smile on his face and he gets an A. Whereas aspirational, like be better than good and be all that you can be, that has to be in the US, it has to be sold. Like it has to be sold, like it has to be pushed. And the US hasn't been really a big market for that. And so I think in India what's really interesting is that you're using actually a really big push market for that aspirational sale, right? As opposed to a remedial sale. And I think that the difference in that is, I think, number one, important. And number two, I would ask, over time, would that change? As the government system becomes better and that there's more transparency around how kids are doing, will that actually change? So I think that's kind of an interesting trend.
It's interesting. The Indian psyche of the parent, though, John, is you hear you have to go from C- to A. In India, I remember many years, if you get an A-, your parents are like, you really messed up. You really need to, get to. All the Chinese folks in the audience are smiling too. I think we're running out of time, so if it's okay, we just take one question. And then the panelists may be here afterwards if you want to do one-on-one. Please.
Do you think that there's a market for U.S.-based companies going into India?
Just the mic, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Do you think if a U.S.-based company wants to get into the Indian education market, what kinds of products and services do you believe are going to be most appealing in the Indian market, and what kind of strategy could they employ to make it happen?
So if the market that you're catering to does not have fragmentation at India level and does not need customization, sure, India is like large eyeball market, right? So your DAUs and your MAUs will shoot up. But if it requires customization at the India level, let's say language or course curriculum, or if it has to deal with Indian fragmentation, then it's going to be a challenge, one. And two, again, like if your service requires monetization that is going to be feet on street, then you better put offices and feet on the ground in India.
So just probably translating that even specifically. So if let's take an example of a math. So math is universal. It doesn't probably require customization, that too at a curriculum level. So there are two ways of approaching this. So there are a lot of companies in US, and not just US, in other parts, who would essentially target math, right, at K-12 level. I'm specifically talking about K-12, which doesn't have a curriculum focus or attached to it. So those things can definitely work. But the moment you enter into and say that, I'm going to address the curriculums of India or a state boards or a central board and so on and so forth, that's when you definitely would require a very strong orchestration and customization at the local level. That's one. And second, on the pricing aspect, as Ishan said, you really need to watch out for the price points. There is a certain price point which we believe people in India are ready to pay online without any intervention, right? But the moment you just cross that, the price point, you definitely require some kind of a push or that kind of an intervention for the sale to happen. Right.
And I'll just connect you to my friend and colleague Kami, because she spends a lot of time thinking about exactly that question of how do you think about market entry, and I've been supporting her in that, so maybe it's good for you guys to. So thank you very, very much. I know there's one more question, if we could just take it offline, if that's all right. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our panelists.
Thank you.